welcome everybody to this event marking the 30th anniversary of the joint declaration issued by the British and Irish governments in Downing Street on the 15th of December 1993. As Ruth said, my name is Katy Hayward. I'm from Queen's University, and I'm honoured to be chairing this panel discussion. As you will have immediately noticed, unfortunately, Geoghegan Quinn has been unable to join us for reasons beyond her control. So Professor Ian McBride, the mastermind behind this event, is stepping in to join Jonathan Stevens and Seán Ó in the discussion. It's highly appropriate that we mark this declaration, given what we know now about its significance for the peace process. It paved the way for a ceasefire and the entry of Sinn Féin into the peace talks. It also laid out a set of principles which 5 years later would come to underpin the agreement. But its gestation was long, several years so, and the final months of its completion were somewhat tortuous and by no means certain. To put it in some context, 1993 was the year in which U2 and Take That and Mr. Blobby chopped the charts. At the start of the year, a Fianna Fáil Labour coalition came into power under Albert Reynolds as Taoiseach, while the Conservatives under Major trailed Labour in the polls, including losing a by-election in my hometown of Newbury. It was the year the Beef Tribunal concluded, and the year that the UK Independence Party was formed. It was the year also in which the first meeting of an Irish head of state with the British monarch took place, when President Mary Robinson made a private visit to Queen Elizabeth in Buckingham Palace. Two of the worst atrocities of the Troubles were carried out within a week of each other that October: the Shankill Road bombing and the Grey Steel massacre. Against that backdrop, the final text of the joint declaration was negotiated line by line by the two governments in the final months of 1993. We know, thanks to the Quill project, what some of those negotiations entailed in terms of adjusting the texts and finessing the sentences. And this evening, we're going to learn more about what they entailed in terms of diplomatic skill, initiative, and relationship building. The joint declaration stands, both in content and presentation, as a mandate for the two governments to work together at every level. This event has been organised in collaboration with the Quill project, as Ruth says, which Ian will say more about, and the ARINS project, which the Royal Irish Academy plays a leading part in. It's wonderful to see such a good audience in this special place, and I know there's immense expertise and first-hand pertinent experience as well as keen interest in this room. A little later, we will open up for the discussions, and I look forward to inviting you to ask questions of the panel. First, though, we will hear from each of the panellists, whom I'll introduce to you now. Seán Ó served as Irish ambassador to the United States between 1997 and 2011 and was subsequently Irish ambassador to Germany. Before that, he was head of the Anglo-Irish division of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, 1991 to 97. In that role, he was one of the tight circle of Dublin officials who was aware of the Joint Declaration Initiative, some of whom are in this room. And it was he and Quentin Thomas who did much of the actual drafting of the text in the autumn of 93. Sir Jonathan Stevens was Permanent Secretary at the Northern Ireland Office for 6 years before his retirement in 2020. He joined the civil service in the NIO in 1983. In 1993, he was Private Secretary to Secretary of State Sir Patrick Mayhew, making him a close witness of the ups and downs of the creation of the Downing Street Declaration. He transferred to the Cabinet Office in 2000 and in 2006 was appointed Permanent Secretary as Director of Modernising Public Service before returning to the NIO in 2014. Professor Ian McBride is Foster Professor of Irish History at Hertford College and Oxford University. Originally an 18th century historian, Professor McBride writes and speaks with authority on political, cultural and intellectual life in Ireland between the 17th and 21st centuries. The author and editor of several highly regarded books, Ian is currently writing a book on Irish Catholics under the penal law based on vast archives in Rome. This has not precluded him, however, from becoming expertly knowledgeable on the Downing Street Declaration, with which he has become, to use his own word, obsessed in recent times. And so it's very appropriate that I ask Ian to open the panel presentations with his opening remarks. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Katy. So you can all hear me, can't you? That's very kind. No one here regrets more than I do the fact that I am not Máire Geoghegan Quinn. I'm a historian, But I come to realise I'm a joint declaration nerd. And I use that word advisedly, not in sense one, as it appears in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a foolish or socially inept person, but in sense three, someone who pursues a technical interest with obsessive dedication. And I'm going to try to explain to you how I've come to be in this situation. So, recent accounts of the origins of the peace process, it seems to me, focus on the heroic work of intermediaries and on the deliberations of clandestine bodies like MI5 or the Army Council of the IRA, who operated largely beyond the public sphere. And the best book, in my view, on this is Neil O'Doherty's Deniable Contact. The author is in the audience this evening. Now, subterranean back channels were crucial to the resolution of conflict, but the messages that passed along the covert pipelines deserve more of our attention than they've received, because they were rehearsing the key political principles upon which peace, an acceptable compromise, was believed to be achievable. Words mattered, and the skill of crafting words mattered, and the people mattered who could create the linguistic space that the various protagonists in Northern Ireland could all inhabit and tolerate. Because the negotiations that led to the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 were only possible because of that work, because of prior exchanges which had worked out the ideological obstacles to peace, or the theological obstacles, the term that was sometimes used in DFA circles. And theology, there was no more difficult part of theology than the concept of self-determination. Now, to most ears, I think that self-determination was just an arcane way of saying United Ireland or Brits out. But technically, the idea conferred legitimacy on any political arrangements made in the island of Ireland that were chosen by the people on the island of Ireland, voting in a single unit. And there hadn't been a vote of that kind or of any kind across the island since 1918, the Sinn Féin landslide in the elections of 1918. As political theorists point out, however, self-determination is a very slippery concept, because we can all agree that the people must decide on their own future. But first, someone has to decide who the relevant people are. That's what the theorists call the boundary question, or the unit question, and that's the question that the Downing Street Declaration attempted to sort out, and I think successfully did sort out. So, understanding that achievement, the risks taken, the delicate political judgments that were involved, the tempers frayed, the pencils snapped. There's only one pencil snapped, I think, and that was John Major's. This is now possible because of the Quill project, which, as we've heard, is based at Oxford. Two members of the Quill team are here this evening, the project manager, Ruth Murray, and the editor, Annabelle Harris. And they've been building a digital archive of the peace process. They know it inside out and back to front. They have scanned vast amounts of documents in the UK and Irish archives. They have developed partnerships with the Macleay Library at Queen's and UCD archives and other institutions. They have collected boxes from garages and attics, beginning with John Alderdice and Monica McWilliams, and then on to the late David Trimble. And what they do is they enable you to visualize those sources and to see the context within which the key decisions were made. So you get a 360-degree view. And for example, if you take Seán Ó, you can see which meetings Seán Ó attended. You can see the history of his exchanges with Quentin Thomas, his British counterpart. You can see the amount of trouble he took over paragraph 4, the paragraph that concerned the right of self-determination. You can see which words mattered most to him. Arguably, Quill will tell you more about what was on Seán Ó mind 30 years ago than Seán Ó can tell you himself. Now, what can we learn from this? The genealogy of the Downing Street Declaration is very complicated. There are several strands of discussion and intermediary work going on simultaneously, mostly intersecting, occasionally competing, and they involve Father Alec Reid, the crucial figure who initiated the whole project, John Hume, of course, and in Dublin, Martin Manser, all writing texts that they think will advance the process. There are dozens of position papers written by Father Reid in the O'Fee archives in Armagh, and they show you how he began to grapple with the concept of self-determination. They show his debt to a secret NIO document written in 1987, which he always called simply the document. And they show how he came up with the idea of twofold consent. Father Reid, I think it's fair to say, had a scissors and paste methodology. He was pulling together bits of text from everywhere, putting them next to each other. He hadn't quite systematically reconciled them, but he understood the direction of the process. The Quill project can show you how that happened. It can show you the key input of John Hume, and it can show you how, in the summer of 1993, Seán Ó and Quentin Thomas began to grapple with the object of making a more balanced text, balanced from a London point of view, or a unionist point of view, that is. There were 20 drafts, more than 20, all in all, of the Downing Street Declaration. You can see how the various sentences and paragraphs evolved. You can see the role of James Molyneux, leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, in all of this, who appears, I've written here, he appears as even more enigmatic than you might think. And I hesitate to say that because enigmatic makes him sound interesting. And he contrived so carefully not to be interesting. But nevertheless, it's surprising what bothered him and what didn't bother him. You can see how the two sides argued over whether North and South would vote collectively, jointly, concurrently, or separately. And you can see the final sentence: the British government agree that it is for the people of the island of Ireland alone, by agreement between the two parts respectively, to exercise their right of self-determination on the basis of consent, freely and concurrently given, North and South, to bring about a united Ireland, if that is their wish. Dermot Nally, who chaired the steering group behind this document, along with Robin Butler, his counterpart on the British side, Dermot Nally said he'd never been involved in a negotiation where there were so many fingers in the pie. And this project enables you to identify all of the fingers and attribute them to their respective bodies. And you can see how the text was constructed in government buildings, in embassies, in hotel rooms at Heathrow, in paramilitary hangouts, in Brussels, as well as in London and Dublin, in various Oxbridge colleges where the British Irish Association met, at the cafe in the National Library of Ireland where Martin Manser liked to meet Father Reid, or on Killiney Beach where the two men walked way back in the very early stages of this story and discussed something that I think most sensible people believed was impossible in 1993, their plan to bring about an IRA ceasefire.
Thank you, Ian. That sets us up very nicely to hand over to Seán for your reflections. Please, Seán.
Thank you very much. I took the precaution of rereading the Downing Street Declaration yesterday, and I must say I was very impressed by it. I thought these were clever guys, you know. It was a strange atmosphere. There had been a kind of a frozen set of people, the provisional IRA. They had tremendous credibility, using that word in the neutral sense, because people thought they could be relied on to act according to their statements. But it was one that came at the price of complete sterility, because the Monty Python derivation they had of Irish sovereignty, namely that it had been taken by a number of people from the survivors from the First Dáil, willed like a small farm to the IRA Army Council, who were then presumed to have legitimacy from that. As I said, it was farcical and Monty Python, or would have been, except people were quite willing to kill and be killed in its implementation. So when, in the 1980s, in the dialogue with the SDLP, there was a clear shift, perceptible to me anyway, in the IRA attitude. It was no longer a fatwa that you had to take on faith and didn't brook any discussion. They had made the transition to feeling the need to justify their position through rational arguments. And that, to me, was a kind of a psychological breakthrough, because it had ceased to operate by fatwa and faith and had become a matter of at least semi-rational political discussion. It was against that background that when it emerged that from Father Reid or Gerry Adams or whomsoever, that a declaration setting out the British position in positive, the British position on Irish sovereignty in positive terms, and in ways that made it clear that there was a possibility, at least, of this being a serviceable model, including for the provisionals. Again, I thought that was a development that it was important to follow up on with great insistence. There was a first draft, which I think was Father Alec and Gerry Adams mainly, which was eventually, it came to us. We took it, we could see there were things in it that were just not going to be possible for the British government. But equally, there were some things that they could very easily subscribe to in certain lights. And a process of drafting began. I called it a floating process, where various hands, Dr. Manzer among them, who's here, began to tweak the text in ways to make it a possible basis for a declaration, which would form, in turn, the basis for an IRS ceasefire. And it was indeed, as Ian said, the product of very many hands. And it was very difficult to be very optimistic at the beginning that it would work. But I think there was a great sense of dedication all around to try and produce the best landing place, which would enable the different parties to meet on an honest and honourable compromise. It wasn't an easy process. I mean, one of the things that I think should be said in judging the great achievement of Albert Reynolds and Dick Spring in managing the transition from the raw product, if you like, that originated with the dialogue with Father Reid and Gerry Adams. The refinement process was, I think, exemplary in terms of the cooperation that existed between the officials in the Department of the Taoiseach and the Department of Foreign Affairs. We really operated as one team, and that was very important. It didn't mean, though, that it was plain sailing. I think there's an assumption when a process comes to a successful conclusion that everything must have been harmonious and sweetness and light. It was an extremely fraught process. I remember on one occasion being mystified by being told by the Taoiseach that I had to be present as a note taker on the following day for a meeting he had with Sir Roderick Lyne and John Major's private secretary. This was very odd because although the departments worked very closely together, they serviced their own processes, if you like. So it was distinctly odd that Albert Reynolds wanted me to take notes at a meeting that he was having. When I went over to his office the following day to be ready, the mystery was clarified. Sir Roderick Lyne was coming with a very specific message. John Major felt, apparently with great conviction, that the Anglo-Irish process would be improved out of non-recognition, indeed transformed, if I was removed from it. So this wasn't a view that I altogether shared, but Sir Roderick, true to his reputation for lightning intellect, concluded that my presence at the meeting was ominous in terms of the stated goal. And I've still vivid memories of half an hour that was nothing so much like an episode from Alan Partridge. Sir Roderick didn't have the quickness to invent a new basis for his meeting, and he wasn't altogether good at improvising the somewhat changed circumstances. And I remember his expression. It was exactly that Alan Partridge saw on television, a truculent sort of resentment that his brilliant idea is not being given due respect by all involved. So at any rate, I avoided his eyes mostly because I found it very difficult to find an expression that wouldn't be gloated. But the point I'm making is that it was not a harmonious, an automatically harmonious relationship. So Roderick, I think, he had been in Moscow and had taken as his model the Russian treatment of the near abroad. And he was a bit resentful, I think, that Ireland didn't rally immediately to the role of the British near abroad. And I don't want to go on about it. He was a very negative influence on the attempts that officials were making on both sides to produce a constructive basis. I mean, I found him, as I said, a destructive and negative force. And it was a mystery why John Major, when he expressed his resentment at the American treatment, never seemed to link it with the quality of the messages that were coming from Sir Roderick into the British system. We had a negative force at the centre of the British-Irish dialogue, I'm sorry to say. And I'm mystified why John Major never did a critical assessment of the impact that this was having on Anglo-Irish relations. Now, when one knows of the difficulty that John Major had, he has to be cut a lot of slack. But at the centre of his system, there was a negative force at work that complicated all our lives at that time. Some academics who know my view of Sir Roderick have sent me excerpts from time to time from the, shall we say, insinuating little messages and takes and tweets that he sent to the Americans under the impression that he was persuading them. And in fact, as I said to the Taoiseach at one occasion, he was a kind of a guarantee that the Americans would never again outsource their Northern Ireland problem to the British, as long as they found this strange mentality at the centre of their system. So I just mentioned this because people assumed that it was plain sailing and that Dick Spring and Albert Reynolds had only to beam and be congenial to the British, and we would advance to the harmony we wanted to see. But my first experience of it was that a serious attempt to ask Albert Reynolds to get rid of me in the interests of progress. And it was not a view I shared, as you might imagine. With that slightly ungracious note, to basically to correct the record of the achievement of Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Spring at that initial stage, I move on to the declaration itself. The idea that the IRA could treat a declaration as making or providing a workable basis for a new departure was very important. We took it very importantly, and there was a minute process of drafting, which I don't recall the details, but I recall the idiom that we felt there was here something that could grow, and as it turned out, that was in fact the case. The attempts on the attribution to both governments of a sentiment of convergence, which is essentially what the declaration was I think, it set the tone for a process that we built on in then the Downey Declaration obviously was a very important milestone. Then the framework document, and the sequences of documents which were successive approximations to the Good Friday Agreement. The change of government, where you had Tony Blair and Jonathan Powell as sensitive and I think honest dealers in the process of Anglo-Irish negotiations, was used with great skill and brilliance by Bertie Ahern, who was Taoiseach, of course, at the time. And it meant that the Good Friday Agreement was the culmination of a series of approximations, which go back to officials in foreign affairs like Ambassador Noel Dorr, who I see here, and a progressive tightening of the references until it became not only the basis for an end of IRA violence, but the basis for the Good Friday Agreement, which was the closest that both governments have come to convergence. I suppose I was so deeply involved in it, it's difficult to have perspective, but I think it was a good beginning. It was built on with great consequence. And I've complained about one influence that was, I think, deleterious, but the other British officials, from Sir Robin Butler, Quentin Thomas was kind of my opposite number, the late John Chilcott, they were very formidable advocates of their government's instructions. But I think where there was a leeway in their instructions to allow for a constructive approach, they took that constructive approach. So I think great credit and honour is due to the British officials who were our partners in steering to an imperfect peace, but a peace that is still infinitely better than the chaos and the murder that preceded it. I remember when at this, what I call the Alan Partridge interview with Sir Roderick, Albert Reynolds was going to his next appointment. And he said, "That's some boy," he said. And for those who are not used to Anglo-Irish idiom or Irish idiom, this was not admiring. I think I always thought that the key to Albert Reynolds was that he had a very he was a religious man in a private way, and I think he was hugely conscious of the duty that he had to try and end the mayhem in Northern Ireland. And I think, especially an official was treating it as one might, the duty-free allowance on a plane journey or something, not conscious of the moral responsibility that there was to put an end to this awful scandal in a religious sense. I think Albert was very conscious of his responsibility in that and inclined to take it seriously. And I think he was scandalized in the religious sense of seeing somebody singing as just the object of bureaucratic games. But as I said, that was a sad exception, in my view, to the general tenor of the British officials, who were exemplary within the limits of their instruction in terms of courtesy and direct dealings and so on. I have nothing but praise for including Jonathan here, of course, but Sir Quentin Thomas, the late Sir John Chilcot, Robin Butler and so on. They were very honourable and worthy partners, and I perhaps should pay a special tribute to that, as I have to single out a negative force that was also at play and tolerated. So,
that sounds like a good time to hand over to Jonathan. We're all the more interested now to hear your thoughts, Jonathan, having been lined up that way. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Katy, and thank you to Quill and ARINS for being the cause of bringing us together. I always find it slightly worrying to find oneself the subject of history. I've had the experience of looking at documents with my name at the bottom that I don't remember, ascribed motivations you never knew you had, and from the many books that have been written, participating in a process that had a cast of hundreds, it seemed, whereas the meetings I remember had a cast of less than 10. Also credit to people to assemble such a distinguished and indeed intimidating audience, distinguished panelists, too many to pick out, many sort of colleagues, friends on the Irish side from various past negotiations going back as far as the 1985 agreement, the Declaration, the Good Friday Agreement, subsequent discussions, agreements, Stormont House, and so on. And it's always good when Northern Ireland is the subject of discussion to know that there are at least some people from Northern Ireland in the audience, not least Mark Durkan. It's good to see over there. Amongst all these key actors who graced the stage, I was but a walk-on extra, a private secretary, a bag carrier. And private secretaries, whether in my case in the Northern Ireland office or in Rod Lyne's case in number 10, are of course simply there to act on their instructions, record the meetings. Although it has to be said, it is not unknown for private secretaries sometimes to represent as the views of their masters what may be their own views, and that is most probably all that it is wise for me to say on the subject of Rod Lyne. But I do want to, Seán has very gracefully played credit to some of the key actors on the British side, late John Chilcot, who I remember with great affection, David Cook, who on our side was responsible for much of the careful drafting, and Quentin Thomas in particular, a master of strategy on our side, political director throughout this period and up to and including the Good Friday Agreement, and Seán's opposite number. Many of us would have paid good money for a ringside seat in the negotiations between Seán and Quentin. Half balletic dance, half gladiatorial combat. You risked your life putting yourself in between them. I think on one occasion, which I've reminded of Seán of on previous occasions, I hazarded some comment that suggested I perhaps did not entirely agree 100% with what Seán had just said, to be soundly put in my place and told, Jonathan, Northern Ireland is both more simple and more complex than you will ever understand. And as with all of Seán's sayings, there is always a root of truth in what is said. People have made reference to the context from which the declaration emerged. And in particular, on the British side, I would draw attention to the partial and ultimately failed attempts over the past decade to address parts of the problem, whether in terms of trying to establish devolution in Northern Ireland, the prior rolling devolution initiative, or to address simply relationships between the two governments in the 1985 agreement. Successful in terms of putting those relationships on a much closer and more even keel, but which had the result of moving political discussions amongst the parties in Northern Ireland into an ice age. With John Major's arrival, the opportunity was there, first of all, with a Prime Minister who attached personal significance and importance to Northern Ireland. His previous private secretary from his time at the Treasury, a good friend and former boss of mine, Jill Rutter, from conversations with him long before he became Prime Minister, remembers asking him what other cabinet post he aspired to in the British cabinet, to be told he would like to be Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, at a time when that posting was seen as exile to Siberia. So he had a sense of personal commitment and engagement, a sense of mission, I think, that the situation in which Northern Ireland found itself, in which people of Northern Ireland lived under constant threat of violence, was unacceptable in the modern age and in a democratic country. And that was reflected in a new and ambitious, radical approach, taken in particular, first of all, under Peter Brook, where instead of setting out to address parts of the problem in series, the ambition was to take a comprehensive approach to seek to address the totality of relationships, and to seek to achieve this on as inclusive a basis as possible, involving all the parties in Northern Ireland, both governments, save only those who were, in British terms, excluding themselves because of their ambiguous, at best, approach at that time to violence. That approach was carried through into political talks in 91 and 92, carried through under the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Paddy Mayhew, that I worked directly for. And the context of engaged ministers, in both Peter Brook's case and Paddy Mayhew's case, who had history, family connections, and a personal strong interest and commitment to Northern Ireland, combined with a Prime Minister who, despite little or no electoral advantage in it, saw it as something which required and deserved his interest, provided part of the important context in which the Downing Street Declaration emerged. So the British objectives in this period were, I would say, first of all, to continue and advance this comprehensive and inclusive approach that first Peter Brook had set out and Paddy Mayhew had continued, ensuring that any political process had the widest possible support. So the challenge here was to bring all parties within the tent, while recognising that gaining one at the cost of excluding another was a recipe for failure. So any approach needed to attempt to be comprehensive and inclusive, but also needed to be robust to whether the hopes of peace were realised or proved, regrettably, elusive or imaginary. It is difficult, looking back, to avoid a sort of deterministic approach to history and to think that everything was inevitable. At the time, it was uncertain, unpredictable, and unknown. But I think there was a clear determination on the British side, from the Prime Minister downwards, that there was an approach and an opportunity here which had to be explored until it either bore fruit or was shown in public to be fruitless, and that until one or other was demonstrated, it would not be possible to move forward the wider political process. And in order to test and demonstrate that approach, and to bring as inclusive an approach as possible, from the British side, any approach had to be consistent with fundamental and long-standing principles: the principle of consent, the principle that political institutions needed to secure the widest possible support, and the principle that political participation could only be on the basis of commitment to exclusively peaceful means. Now, without going into all the twists and turns of I think Ian referred to 20 drafts, this meant, from the British side, taking initial drafts that to our eyes seemed at times to be vague or ambiguous, uncertain, and in some respects impossible to accept, and negotiating from that a text which preserved the hope and offer of peace, but in ways which were consistent with the fundamental principles I've outlined, that were clear, unambiguous, and could withstand forensic examination, whether around the Downing Street cabinet table, and John Major had few natural friends around that table, or forensic examination by unionist eyes. I think that process, people have paid tribute, rightly so, to the subtlety and drafting expertise of the officials involved, but also I think it required negotiating expertise from both John Major and Albert Reynolds. The ability both to see the opportunity that was there, but also the courage to stand that there were certain principles that either had to be reflected and incorporated, or the draft could go nowhere. Sometimes that resulted in very difficult meetings. I remember the Dublin summit, which happened at one of those slightly fraught moments of British-Irish relationships, which I was present, and that was the occasion on which John Major broke his pencil as a sign of his irritation, although at the very far end of the table, I was the last recipient of the note he sent along his side after he had broken his pencil, which just said in his familiar scrawl, "Don't worry, I'm not really angry." And the resulting text, as people have already said, married consent and married self-determination so that, like the chicken and the egg, it becomes impossible to say which precedes which. Although note that British ministers attached particular importance to having successfully secured Northern Ireland's constitutional guarantee as the first principle which was referenced in the Downing Street Declaration, on the basis that, as they said, when Jim Molyneux reads it, we want him to see the constitutional guarantee first before he gets to anything else. Chicken and egg is a rather inelegant way. My good friend and ex-colleague David Cook puts it like this: the two themes of self-determination and consent were intertwined in a double helix of elegant complexity, which provided the DNA running throughout the Declaration. Just to conclude with some lessons to be learned from this, I think, first of all, on the central constitutional question, the Downing Street Declaration essentially settled the issue, as Seán has already said, so that the Good Friday Agreement talks almost passed over it without really needing to spend any time on it at all. But it was of significance that those talks adopted that principle, converted it into the Good Friday Agreement, and then as such it was endorsed in referendums, so finally ending almost a century of division on that central issue. And I think there are still important lessons from how the process operated. Lessons, I think, which are still worth learning today. First of all, that frustrating as it is, it remains important to take a comprehensive and inclusive approach. And attempts to solve one problem at a time or engage with the needs and wishes of one party at a time are generally not sustainable or result in a constant flip-flopping from one side to the other. Second, that the two governments, the British and Irish governments, working together can be a powerful driver for agreement. They can identify and craft creative and acceptable solutions to problems which may be beyond the wit or the ability or the political courage of any one political party in Northern Ireland to put forward. Conversely, I can't think of any major progress or development that has been possible in Northern Ireland that has not had the active support and engagement of both governments. But neither the governments working together nor one on its own can impose lasting solutions. Ultimately, the Downing Street Declaration proved of lasting value because its central principles were adopted by the parties and endorsed in referendums north and south by the people. And approaches today, still remains the case, which do not seek to engage and secure agreement across the parties and ultimately garner widespread public support, will not be sustainable or succeed. So I would argue the route to progress continues to be, as throughout the 90s, through a process which is comprehensive, which is inclusive and addresses the concerns of all parties, in which a close relationship between the British and Irish governments can and should be a driving force for agreement, but which ultimately rests on securing and sustaining widespread agreement. And there are no shortcuts to achieving that. Thank you.
I'm inclined to say amen to that, and not just because we've talked about the theological elements of the agreement. Before I open it up to the floor for questions, and I'm sure there are many arising from what's being said, I would just like to ask each of you a question, the same question. And it's in relation to the document that Seán has already described as an impressive document, which you all have a copy of up here, and I think it's safe to say it's all been printed off the Irish government's website, given that there isn't a copy, I gather, on the UK government's website at this moment. I would like to ask you, maybe beginning with you, Seán, if there's a particular line in the declaration that has significance for you, or that you'd like to particularly highlight for any particular reason. I can start with anybody who's... Are you ready to start, Seán? Yeah.
I have one sentence. I have one sentence that is not a candidate for that distinction. It is that both governments also consider the development of Europe will of itself require new approaches to serve interests common to both parts of the island of Ireland and to Ireland and the United Kingdom as partners in the European Union. So I think it proves the point, as Yogi Berry said, that prophecy is very difficult, especially about the future. It's difficult to pick out a single sentence because there is a coherent fabric in the declaration, which is, as you say, reconciling the principles of Irish self-determination and consent, and including the consent of both parts of Ireland. So I would pass up the challenge of picking out a single sentence that is the kernel of the thing. It's a fabric of reasoning that really belongs as a single unit. And I think taking any single sentence out of context probably distorts the purpose of the declaration in many ways.
And to disappoint you, Katy, I agree with Seán in that it is the brilliance of the balance of the declaration which is its success, and to sort of parse and separate out one sentence above others, I think would be unfair.
Okay, Ian?
Well, yeah, I haven't got any difficulty in picking out a single sentence because it's the one that I read out earlier. I think it's sentence 6 of paragraph 4, and it's the one that shows that the right of self-determination of the people of Ireland and the consent principle are intertwined and not opposing. And without that, every time you wanted to negotiate all of those steps up to the Good Friday Agreement, you would have had to address the future of the border. And that sentence knocked that problem out of the way. But one thing I'd just add about it is there's something that's not said in that sentence or anywhere in the Downing Street Declaration. And what's not said is Northern Ireland has the right of self-determination. And it's important to say that because it's often misunderstood. In John Major's autobiography, he says 3 or 4 times the point of the Downing Street Declaration was to specify that Northern Ireland had the right of self-determination. It's said by Jonathan Powell in Great Hatred, Little Room, and it's a mistake. If Northern Ireland had the right of self-determination, it would be able to declare itself independent. It would be able to declare that it wanted to be integrated more fully into the United Kingdom. It would be able to lose parts of its territory if it wanted. And this was discussed during the negotiations, and Seán Ó pointed out to John Chilcot, who brought it up, no, it's not a good idea thinking of Northern Ireland as a self-determining unit. The other thing that doesn't appear anywhere is a recognition that Ulster Unionists, most of them, didn't see themselves as part of the people of Ireland. They saw themselves as British, part of the British people. In that sense, I think the document accelerates a distancing and even a decolonising feeling in London. And it's a problem that Ulster Unionists haven't really come up with an answer to.
Today. Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Mansa here, and just wait for the microphone from...
make one or two quick observations. I would have a sentence that I quote most often from the Declaration, which was a late edition by John Hume, which is, "It is for those who believe in a united Ireland to persuade those who don't, sort of peacefully without violence," etc. Sean might like to know, John Major and Rod Lyne, accompanied by Rod Lyne, came over a good many years afterwards to celebrate some anniversary of the Downing Street Declaration. And while Major was warmly positive about it, Rod Lyne made it clear that he still didn't really agree with it. And, you know, one other line which a later Secretary of State would have liked to have had omitted is at the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. You know, Patrick Mayhew and indeed Brooke were members of that, but Mayhew told me he personally would never have made the statement about Britain having no selfish strategic, political, or economic interests. But I would like to emphasize that, I mean, the vast majority of British officials, beginning with John Chilcot, you know, were very constructive. Now, I would have to say when a change of government occurred in Westminster, it noticeably became a little more flexible. I would like to pay warm tribute to Sean. Sean and myself worked extremely closely together in very difficult circumstances, especially in the autumn of 1993, where close understanding was required, and again in the interim period of June-July 97, when the second ceasefire had to be done. Now, there is just one point I'd like to make. I mean, apart altogether from drafting, by the way, the one point I would make about drafting is that self-determination is something that was never recognized by the British 100 years ago, or even since. That was brought in as, if you like, ideological balance to consent. Now, I would quite accept that this may not have significantly altered the substance of the situation, but it certainly altered the atmospherics of the situation. And I mean, I think to be fair to the British government, they allowed themselves to and this is the government of John Major now, to sound more green than they would normally permit themselves to doing. But there was one other dimension to it which wasn't purely a drafting one, is that trust had to be built up with those outside the process, whether one was talking about Republicans or loyalists, or somebody who remained definitely behind the scene. He's been mentioned, you know, James Molyneux. Now, we got drafts of the best part of 3 paragraphs from Archbishop Eames given to Albert Reynolds, which were included with practically no editorial changes. Likewise, there was a paper from the Reverend Roy McGee, and again, with, I think, possibly the single addition of the word gender into the various equal rights that there had to be. That was put in, which meant that they had some purchase on the document that came out. So I think it was a bit more than just an intergovernmental negotiation. That was vital, but there were other people who had to be brought on board and, if possible, kept on board. Now, you can say that Sinn Féin never was on board, and they ultimately rejected the Downing Street Declaration, but that was the better to cover their tracks.
Thank you, Martin. That's very interesting. We have another question from Rory Montgomery.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful treat. As I think Ian knows, I share his nerdish tendencies, nerdish in the best sense, of course. 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago, I was assigned to the Anglo-Irish Division for the first time under Sean's magnificent leadership, and he was a man from whom I learnt an enormous amount. I have to say, though, that if Jonathan says he was a bag carrier and a walk-on part, not only did I play no part whatever in the negotiation of the Downing Street Declaration, I didn't even know it was being negotiated until it happened. And the one thing I did was that Sean asked me to take an envelope out to the Blackrock Clinic and to hand it over to Cardinal Cathal Daly, who was a patient there at the time. And I went into the Cardinal's room where he was in, dressing gown and pyjama and slippers, and gave him the document, and that was the full extent of my engagement. But there's lots I could say, many comments and observations about the way the text evolved up to the Good Friday Agreement, where of course a big difference was that there's a couple of additions, mostly the same, but of course we made what had been a series of unilateral declarations into a series of bilateral commitments. But one question really relating to James Molyneux and what Ian said at the beginning about the things James Molyneux cared about and didn't care about, and again coming back to this question of the balance between self-determination and consent. There were some in the British system who would every now and then talk about, even informally, talk about the self-determination parts as, quote, necessary nonsense, unquote. And I was always rather amazed, I have to say, in the Good Friday Agreement and elsewhere, that the Unionists didn't make more of an issue about this concept of there being a people of Ireland with the right of self-determination. So, so did Molyneux accept this because consent came first in the text? Was it one of the things he cared about? And what other things did he care about in particular?
Rory, I'll just take another question from Noel Dorr.
Thanks very much. Like Sean, I read the document we're talking about in the past few days. I think it's a remarkable document. It's been said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. This was designed not only by committees, but with so much input from all over the place. I don't think it's only because of the concurrent referenda. I'm not even sure if it mentions referenda in the declaration, but maybe it does. But there's much in it that's of great interest, and it's remarkable that it was put together as it was and that it reads so well today. Having said that, I want to pick up his point about successive approximations, which led eventually to the Good Friday Agreement. Forgive me if I tend to see a wider context to that, successive approximations going back much farther. Jonathan Stevens talked about the two governments working together closely. There was a time in 1969-70 when they were very much at odds. And eventually Jack Lynch and Ted Heath came together, and out of that came Sunningdale. That was the first try which worked on the basis of North-South Council of Ireland and, of course, power sharing, which was the new element at the time. But the British government actually had abdicated a little, and in the Sunningdale Agreement Declaration, it seems to have just a residual role almost to look after its own interest, leaving it to North-South. Move on to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, where Sunningdale was the North and South. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 85 is the two governments, leaving out the parties in Northern Ireland, but with the facility, of course, for them to come back in if they would agree on power sharing. Move on then to the Brooke-Mayhew talks, and the question I'm going to ask at the end is how to situate that, how the panel might situate that. Was it important or not? These are the talks in the early 90s. And that actually brought in the two governments and the parties in Northern Ireland, but not the spokesperson for the extremes. So you're building gradually, it seems to me, successive approximations. It seems to me the Brooke-Mayhew talks may have been important in that, for instance, Ian Paisley sat down with the Irish government. I think it's probably the first time that Unionist Party, or the Unionists from Northern Ireland and an Irish government sat down together to negotiate since 1925, the Boundary Commission, at the agreement at that time. So you then move on to the document we're talking about, which sort of put all those elements together and brought in or worked towards bringing in the extremes. So I'd just like to suggest that that successive approximations idea carried us from the 1969, very difficult between the two governments, to where we are today. But my question comes then, how do you situate that? Brooks-Mayhew talks, did they help at all? They were a failure in their time, but did they at least give substance to the idea of the three strands? And secondly, accustom the Irish government to sitting down and arguing their point, four ministers, and perhaps had an educational effect on them of the strength of unionist opinion, and therefore, if you like to use the phrase, almost softened up the Irish side on eventual constitutional change, which of course was the key in the end to this settlement that we have achieved.
Thank you very much. So, there's questions on bringing those from outside the talks in terms of having purchase on the ultimate declaration, the issue of consent and self-determination, how important linking those two together was for bringing in unionists in particular, and then the Brooke-Mayhew talks in the context of successive approximations towards a Good Friday Agreement. Who would like to go first, Seán?
On the point about the Brooke-Mayhew talks, Oliver Napier, I think, launched the idea that this was just cynical theatre on the part of the Irish government, that make-believe, while they were pursuing the real quarry, that's to say the comprehensive agreement that eventually emerged, while they were pursuing that elsewhere. That actually is not true. There were several reasons why the Irish government took these talks seriously. One was there was absolutely no guarantee that the outreach to the Republicans would work. In fact, on the probabilities, it could fail, not just because the Republicans might be acting in bad faith, but even if they were acting in good faith, there was no guarantee that they could bring this result over the line. So the other talks were important because they might well end up being the only game in town. And secondly then, as I think Noel hinted in his remarks, they were a very useful dress rehearsal for the techniques and the formats that were used to very good effect in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement. So on two levels. One, that they could well have proved to be the only option available if the outreach to the Republicans had failed for whatever reason. And then secondly, anything that could be achieved in them could be banked, at least metaphorically, and used in the more solid talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So they were taken quite seriously all round. And certainly the Irish government were not using them as hollow theatre.
I would very much agree with that assessment. And it was the Brooke-Mayhew talks and the three-stranded approach set out by Peter Brook in his statement of 26th of March 1991, which proved the basis on which the Good Friday talks happened, that has reflected itself with its different strands in the Good Friday Agreement. So, and also, as Seán has just referred, the prospect of peace and Sinn Féin entering the political process was an uncertain one at that stage, and that's why, in our terms, the British government had to have a strategy that was robust to whether or not that hope could be realised or proved illusory. And I think also the Brooke-Mayhew talks were significant because, as I recall it, there was very little engagement amongst the parties in that period. What engagement there had been had entered into this sort of ice age of unionist opposition to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, to the extent that they insisted that such talks could only take place in the intervals between meetings of the Intergovernmental Conference, and they ended ultimately because there was a meeting of that Intergovernmental Conference, and from unionist points of view, that brought it to an end. But the talks did achieve substantive progress on discussion on Strand 1, institutions within Northern Ireland, much of which was carried forward into the Good Friday Agreement, and had, I think, a first meeting at least on Strand 2 as well. If I may pick up Rory's question about what did Jim Molyneux care about, this was always difficult to discern. One of my most challenging moments as a private secretary was an occasion when Paddy Mayhew took Jim Molyneux through a text of the joint declaration. And this took place during a journey between London and Belfast on Secretaries of State then used a small RAF jet, sort of six-seater or so. And so there was a loud background hum of aircraft noise. Jim never spoke much above a whisper at the best of times, and often it was reduced to a mumble. On this occasion, because he was dealing with such significant and secret matters, he clearly thought even greater discretion and quietness was required. And seeing the presence of other officials on the plane, he put his fist in front of his mouth. And so I could only discern what he had said by close interrogation of the Secretary of State afterwards. But the argument that the British government put to him throughout this was there is absolute cast-iron guarantees throughout this about Northern Ireland's constitutional guarantee, the principle of consent. Whatever else is said, you can be sure of that, and it is written in every critical part of the document. And they also advanced the case, and I would give credit to Jim for recognising this, that if there was a chance of peace, and at that stage it was uncertain, that it would be irresponsible and indeed the duty of any British government to pursue it until either it bore fruit or it was demonstrated to be fruitless. And I think that that was an argument that he listened to and received carefully.
I'd like to come back on Jim Molyneux also. I mean, it's just the meetings with Molyneux were strange in tone because he was actually an Ulster Unionist who liked to avoid confrontation, which is an unusual thing. He was very courteous. He met Michael Ancram, for example, alone usually, that is, without other Unionist MPs. He wasn't bothered about the Irish people having the right of self-determination, and I wonder if that's partly because he was 73 at the time and he belonged to an older generation of Ulster Protestants that hadn't really forgotten that they were Irish. He wasn't too bothered about Articles 2 and 3, and the speculation on the British side was that he liked them because it emphasised how intractable Dublin was. And if they got rid of them, then he'd really be in trouble. The thing that really bothered him was something that Alec Reid built into this process at the beginning and that John Hume also pursued, and that was that there should be an Irish convention at the end of the process that would settle political structures for the island. And it was pretty clear that Albert Reynolds was downplaying this element very early on. It was to be consultative. It wasn't to have any decision-making powers. But because of press leaks in November 1993, quite a bit of attention had been given to suggestions that some sort of joint sovereignty was in the offing, or some north-south body with executive powers was being planned. And for that reason, it really bothered him, and he wanted to get rid of it. And he did get rid of it to the extent that it became the forum for peace and reconciliation, and it was very clear that it was operating in this jurisdiction and not for the island as a whole. But the interesting thing is, in almost every way, David Trimble was the opposite of Molyneux, and if he had become leader 2.5 years earlier, he would have been spiky, not courteous. He would have brought other people to the meetings. He was the Ulster Unionist most interested in self-determination for Ulster, and he'd advocated Dominion status for Ulster in 1988, and the whole thing would have been much more complicated, I think.
Thank you, Ian. We're drawing to a close now, so I just want to give you the chance on the panel to ask each other a question, if you might have a question for each other 30 years on. I know Ian has some questions. Alternatively, I can venture asking another question, even though my last question didn't go so well. Okay, we'll do that. It's a nasty one. But I mentioned before that the Joint Declaration is in content and presentation a mandate for the two governments to work together at every level. And we're all very conscious, 30 years on, at the moment, that partnership looks fragile. And very conscious too, following on from your point, Jonathan, about the importance of the British and Irish governments working together, and that being key all the way through the last 30 years of making progress, that we're all currently depending on a situation in which we're having bilateral talks with a single government and a single party. So I told you it was nasty. My question is, does this mean that the fundamental principles and assumptions that we saw rooted in and grown from the Downing Street Declaration of that partnership is now in grave trouble? Or maybe alternatively it means that we've moved into a different phase whereby reassurance and close, maybe trust building or relationship building again is important within one single dimension of this complicated arrangement. Does anybody want to answer that?
I would say that during most of our discussions with the British, we were canvassing models that were self-sufficient into themselves. In other words, that it didn't depend on further, let me put it another way, that it would have been possible to park developments at the status quo in Northern Ireland, and that we were careful to leave that option open, but equally well to build in the possibility of more dynamic structures, new structures. One idea that I have had, but I never developed it because it's too much in what I call the bell the cat category. In other words, brilliant idea, but rather difficult to execute. And that would be on Baget's famous distinction between the useful and the ornamental elements in British politics. You could imagine a situation where if the tide of opinion goes in favour of Irish unity, that I would hope the nationalist tradition would be sensible enough to give a reassurance to the unionist community. And I thought that one form of reassurance might be to repurpose Hillsborough, the building and the idea of a British presence, not with the executive powers, because I think you've only to look at various members of the British cabinet to know that any right of regard in terms of the government of Ireland would almost certainly be abused and weaponised. So not that, but to take the more ornamental aspects, to, for example, to have someone as the patron of British citizens in Ireland, give that person certain functions to raise an alarm if there was some gross abuse of the rights of the unionist people, to have a kind of a patron role in a good sense in terms of fostering and recognising the British tradition in Ireland as well, not as a rival government, but as a recognised strand in our you could imagine if there was a British royal that was lacking, both useful and lacking in employment, you could appoint that person to patronise the British tradition in Ireland, to give decorations on basis of contributions in one way or another. I mean, I always thought it was a terrible pity that Northern Ireland, which ideally should have been a link between Britain and Ireland and a friend to both, if you like, became instead what's the tactful word, a point of contention. And if that could be turned around and the point of contention could be substituted with an extra recognition of the British dimension of the many unionist citizens that would find themselves in a single polity in Ireland if opinion goes that way. We should be thinking in terms of that kind of reassurance that the average unionist citizen would conclude that, well, with this arrangement, the worst nightmares would not be possible. So there would be things like that, I think, that might eventually be invoked if we get to a point where the opinion goes in the direction of a single United Ireland policy.
Thank you, Seán. Jonathan?
So I hope that the relationship is not in lasting trouble. We've been through an incredible and challenging period. You know, the sort of Brexit referendum was an earthquake which completely unanticipated at the time of either the Downing Street Declaration or the Good Friday Agreement, and sort of shook the foundations. You know, actually, given the strength of the earthquake, I think it is important to recognise that those foundations still exist, still stand, a bit shaky maybe, but you know, the Good Friday Agreement remains a central part of British policy and Irish policy, of course. Of course, you know, there's a preoccupation at the moment with trying to restore the institutions in Northern Ireland, bring the DUP back into the fold. You know, one way of looking at this period in the early 90s is that the preoccupation for a period was with bringing Sinn Féin in from the cold. You know, I think both efforts, the one in the 90s, the one now, are worth doing because my argument was you need as inclusive a process as possible. And frustrating as that is, and requiring great patience, it is better to proceed on that basis, if you can, important qualification, than to just cut one or the other out of it. But ultimately, although that may require at particular times particular focus on one party or one side or another, ultimately you do have to return to this comprehensive approach and this inclusive process. The other parties have to be brought into this. Any basis for bringing one party back into the fold has to be a basis which other parties will accept and that will promote, ultimately, agreement. And that has to be the hope that we remain committed to. I personally think one of the tragedies of where we are now, I think, is that the cause of instability, most recently, has been sourced, I would say, outside of Ireland. I mean, you know, the parties within Northern Ireland have difficulties enough at times reaching agreement amongst themselves. Worth noting that this bout of instability was largely caused outside the parties. And I think it is worth just recognising, as Ian was doing, some of the challenges that unionism faces now. The sense that actually Brexit, you know, has increased their sense of betrayal. You know, it's difficult to count up the number of times that they can think of themselves as betrayed by others, and most of all by the British government, and the sense of alienation and isolation that that produces, and the sense of fear that that produces that may manifest itself in aggression, but is actually born, I think, of an underlying fear. And it's important and interesting thoughts from Seán as to how some of those underlying fears might in time and in the future be addressed. But I also think in the end, British and Irish governments have fundamental common and shared interests that will always bring them back together. And as I suggested, that it is actually only when they're really working together on the basis of all the sort of agreements in the past and the three-stranded process and all of that, it's only when they're actually pointing together in the same direction, pulling in the same direction, that real progress can be made.
Thank you, Jonathan. Last word to you, Ian.
Yep. Just to pick up on Jonathan's final remarks there, 30 years ago, the big threat to the United Kingdom was Irish nationalism in its militant manifestation. And in recent times, it's been English nationalism. If anybody was interested in improving Anglo-Irish relations, I think there's a lot to inspire in the story that we've been talking about this evening, because there is great creativity and imagination that went into the joint declaration 30 years ago, and huge patience. And one of the things that puzzled me as I read through these documents was that the British, between, let's say, JD1, the first version, and JD14, each time one of these came out, the British said, this is useless, it's not going anywhere, this won't work, but we want to keep discussing it. And I started thinking, well, why is that? They've got a lot of other things going on, Maastricht, all that sort of thing. I thought, why did they keep coming back? And the answers were, maybe John Major liked Albert Reynolds. I think that was part of it. He thought that Albert Reynolds was sincere. That was also part of it. But he also thought Ireland as a partner in the European Union, what was becoming the European Union at that time, and therefore we can't just walk away. And unfortunately, that partnership is gone.
But it still continues to be important. Thank you very much. That's a perfect note to conclude on. Please join me in thanking the panel.